Welcome back to Soul Sessions. We're continuing our series on mythology. This time we're talking about shame and the myth of Adam and Eve, the birth of shame. Go ahead.
I was going to say, let's start with a question. This year we're going to be doing something new. We're going to take a question from one of our listeners. And so if you have a question, go to Creative Mind Life and submit your question, and we'd love to answer it if we pick it for the show. But right now, let's go to a question from Susan in New York. What do myths have to do with modern life? Why do we need to learn ancient stories that seem irrelevant to my current life?
Good question.
Tell us, Dr.
You asked
Rob.
that. I'm glad you asked that. What do myths have to do with life in general, especially in our modern technological age? Jung would say that myths reveal to us the truth in story form. Instead of just thinking about the moment, about what's going on now, and basing our interpretation of the meaning of life based on what is currently or what we perceive in the world as the current situation, mythology points to a deeper foundational truth, and it explains our place in the universe. What are we doing here? What is our purpose? Why life, and all those things that, if you think about it, science does not address, because they're not interested in answering those questions. They're interested in
Like philosophical questions?
Yeah.
So it's more about the myths give us a philosophical understanding of a deeper meaning in our life.
That's right. And without a mythology, without a vision, the people perish, right? I think it's from the Bible. What that means is that without this mythology, we're not really able to function appropriately or adequately in human life, because we don't have roots. We're kind of adrift without meaning, without guidance of some sort.
Well, if we think about just our life, it's a story. I mean, if someone says, tell me about yourself, you'll tell them in a story form. So you have your own myth of your life. So we live in myth all the time. And then our myth is our interpretation of our life and our childhood and our experience at work and our experience in different facets of relationships.
Yeah.
And so we have our own myth that we live through. So then when we hear these other myths, it relates to us on a deeper level, because just innately that's how we process meaning in our existence.
Yes, and speaking of mythology, we are speaking of the myth of creation of Adam and Eve from a psychological perspective. In other words, we're not criticizing a religious point of view. We respect all beliefs and all religions, so please take it as our interpretation from a Jungian perspective or Jungian coaching perspective.
So today we're talking about Adam and Eve and shame. So let's start with, what is the creation myth?
Yeah, so, in thinking about the question that Susan asked, there are two myths right now that are competing for kind of contemporary human attention, because if you think about the Big Bang Theory, it's a creation myth. Science won't admit that, right? They say, no, we're working rationally and in kind of a methodical, scientific way. And of course, that's true to some extent. But if you look at what they're talking about, they're talking about a creation myth of how did we get here? What, how did light come up to be? How did the planet come to be? How did humans?
We didn't just pop into this world and there's no history. So the archaeologists are always looking for clues of the earliest man and how we evolved, and
evolution,
and the stars and how they were created, how the earth was formed, all those things.
Yeah, and so the other myth, of course, is this ancient myth of Adam and Eve and, Genesis. In the beginning, there was darkness, and then God kind of breathed over the waters and created the heaven and the earth, which is a competing myth. And that's why you see people in these two different camps in intense disagreement with each other, because you're talking about a different cosmology. Mythology, especially the creation myth, is meant to give us an orientation as to what is the meaning of this universe, of the created universe. And so if you're basing your life on the Big Bang Theory, it's going to appear, the universe is going to appear to you very differently than
cold, right? Meaningless almost?
Well, it depends.
Okay.
I like the creation, the Big Bang Theory. It's an interesting...
like the intelligence and our part in it.
Yes. But the point is that the universe is going to look very different if you subscribe to the Genesis myth, creation myth, right? Where God is at the center of the creation. In the Big Bang Theory, there is no divine element guiding the creation. It simply happens through natural laws. And so you see these two competing creation myths existing at the same time, and therefore you kind of start to see, why do people disagree so intensely and so emotionally? Because they're operating on different cosmologies. Anyways, that's as a side note. But a creation myth definitely gives us a sense of why is there order in the universe versus chaos. And usually there's a story as to there was a primal chaotic element or darkness out of which came light, order, form. Creation myths also talk about the foundation of the land. Why did the land appear? How did it appear? How did it come to be?
How did the earth form?
How did the earth form? Yes.
And then how did humans emerge?
How did humans emerge, and what is the meaning
of why we're here?
Of why we're here, yes.
So in the Adam and Eve myth, it's God created Adam first out of the earth, right? And then took his rib and breathed life into it to give birth to Eve. Yes. Because he felt he was alone and he needed companion.
Yes, and keep in mind we're talking about the myth, or we're looking at the myth strictly from a psychological perspective. We're not interested in is this true or not true. We understand myths to represent many things to many people and be interpreted in many different ways.
So psychologically, there's masculine and feminine. Yes. They're in this Garden of Eden, which is this beautiful paradise. They're one with everything. They have like unlimited supply, abundance. Everything is given to them. It's like effortless. And so we think about that. Even when we think about our unlimited self, it kind of reflects that in a way.
Yeah. In the story, it really paints a picture of paradise, which is in a way heaven, right? It's that they're part of the kingdom of heaven. They're still innocent in that they haven't experienced duality, and therefore they haven't experienced shame.
It's almost like a child that's innocent, that's born. They think everything is good until something happens, and then they're like, wait a minute. The world isn't as nice and loving as I thought it was.
Yes. And so the serpent, that from our perspective represents higher knowledge or consciousness or self-awareness, when the serpent enters the picture, they become aware. Their eyes are open, and they realize they're naked, and they become ashamed. They have shame for the first time in the story.
And it's because of the duality, the good and evil, that they're aware of there's kind of a dark side to humanity.
Yes.
Or to themselves.
Yes. If you think of shame, it's that self-reflection, right? We're very conscious. We become very conscious of our actions, our thoughts, our status.
Self-conscious in a way. Yeah.
Very self-conscious, exactly. But it's a hyper sense of self-consciousness.
Like worried about what other people think. Yeah. Am I doing the right thing? Am I a good human being? All those things that, and religion teaches us, you don't sin and being kind to others. And
yes, and so when we do that, of course, we're going to come up short. Mm-hmm. Because nobody's perfect, and we've all made mistakes. That's the way we learn in the world, by making mistakes. And so shame is very tied to that self-awareness that enters the picture with the eating of the fruit of knowledge.
And if you have no shame, then it's really not a good thing, because then you don't have that reflective or compassion. You can be very destructive if you don't have shame, or you're not conscious of it. You suppress it.
Yes. Yeah, from a biological perspective, we see the usefulness of shame, especially in group animals or beings, that we need to feel shame if we hurt other people or those around us, because if we don't, then we'd be terrible people, and the group would not be able to stay together. They would fall apart essentially, because people would be doing terrible things to each other, and they would say, "Well, this is not worth staying in the group. Let's go our separate ways."
And that's basically how we've been. Through time, we dealt with shame as a community. We punish the criminals, put them away, or we put them in the locks, and everyone has to watch them or throw the fruit at them, or the food at them. And we like that scene from Game of Thrones where Cersei had to walk through the whole town naked. And the woman was like with the bell going, shame, shame, shame. I mean, that was like such an intense, for me, scene, because it was like we all felt that. We all feel that, like when we're ashamed, we all feel like the whole world is looking at us and yelling and throwing stuff at us when it's not even real. So we can get to the extreme of that. But we see that through time. As a community, we kind of use shame to control people's behavior. In a way.
Sure.
Or if we didn't have it, I think people would do terrible things to each other. So it's almost something we have to live with, and not. But we're going to talk a little bit about more how to work with it. But it's not a bad thing to have. It's really a sign of self-awareness or self-consciousness.
It's very, very much tied to self-awareness, which is what we call our conscious awareness, right? Our self-awareness. If we didn't have self-awareness, there would be no shame, essentially, or very little. It would just be kind of more of a mechanism.
Like shameless. Some people are just shameless. They don't have that self-reflecting, and they kind of act reckless, in a community. And then you're like, well, they don't have any shame, and they can be very destructive. So it's a good regulator to work in the world of other human beings.
Yes. Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about how shame operates in our emotional life, let's say. So there's a difference between mood and affect. So mood we can think of as the general emotional pitch that we experience for long periods of time. In other words, it's the long game. In psychology, in clinical psychology, they talk about mood disorders. And what they usually mean by mood disorder is depression.
Oh.
or
Well, it's almost
dysthymia.
like the inability to regulate your own mood.
Yeah,
Where you can't like control the mood takes over.
the mood takes over. That's right. And it's a disorder of mood because it kind of robs the individual of their motivation, their ability to enjoy life, their happiness.
Yeah.
Yeah, some people even destroy their own life, right?
Yeah.
Because of depression. There are other lesser forms of depression called, there's one called dysthymia. So dysthymia is a kind of a low-grade depression where the individual starts to get used to that feeling and they start to think, well, maybe that's as good as my life gets. It's almost like that movie, As Good as It Gets.
As good as it gets, yeah. Kind of like a complacency. You just kind of like, well, I guess this is it, but you're not like hopeless in a way.
Yeah, it's kind of a low-grade sense of hopelessness, meaninglessness, right? That the individual has problems finding meaning in the stuff that they're doing, so they're not enjoying their life. And some people just stay there and they think, there's nothing I can do about it. That's just my personality.
But they're not like in suicidal
Right.
or, incapacitated, but they just have that kind of numbness maybe. They're going through life and they're just kind of numb.
Yes.
But it's not like as intense as depression where they can't even function,
That's right. And then there's others, kind of those bipolar disorders, and that there's these wild swings or sometimes milder swings from pole to pole, from depression to high intensity activity. But that's beside the point. Let's say the mood versus affect.
So the mood can be as deep as depression, but also the height of elation. Like you win the Olympics, or you get the gold medal, or you achieve some goal, or that kind of superstar being on stage, and there's thousands and thousands of people cheering your name. that elation that comes with that. So it could be that height. Or having the first child. When I was a hypnotherapist, I would always ask people what their happy moment was, the happiest moment of their life, so they can anchor it in. And almost everyone that was a mother said, when my baby was born and I held the child. So that's that elation. So it doesn't have to be like, but it's that deep like sense of joy. And so we have that. And then the other spectrum that human beings can fall into. Most of us kind of,
we're in the middle.
Yeah, we're kind of in the middle. We're not like always like that all the time. We kind of have that middle ground, right?
Yeah, it's the golden mean, that normal curve. Most of us fall right around the middle, and then there's a tail that is the extreme elation, and the other tail which is extreme depression. With very few people in it.
So with shame, we deal with, it can be, so what is the mood?
Yeah, so affect then, as opposed to mood, is the short term, the moment to moment expression of emotion. That's the affect.
Okay.
And so within the bigger scope of mood, let's say a person is...
they have that kind of a section. So they're either really in that depressed state all the time, or they're pretty happy, positive, or they're kind of in the middle. They go, and so in that range, there's an affect in that range.
In the moment to moment, yes. Where the affect can vary. In one day, you can be happy one moment, express sadness another moment, etc.
But you kind of regulate back. You don't stay stuck and get caught up in that would be a mood disorder. Right.
Yeah, one of the best definitions I learned through my clinical training was, what is mental health? You can think of it as flexibility, emotional, psychological flexibility, the ability to adapt to situations and bounce back.
So rigidness is kind of a sign of there's something, like you can't get yourself out.
You can't get yourself out, or you only have one way of reacting and responding to stress. That becomes problematic for individuals because, life is always throwing us curveballs.
Yeah.
And that's just the nature of it. You can't control everything. So the affect then, when we think about shame, you can think of it as, well, we all experience shame, and it's a natural part of being a human being, right? When we do something wrong, or we just self-reflect about our
like
past.
Getting older and, wow, I can't believe I haven't done these things with my life. Or
Yes. I mean, you can start from the very beginning, right? As children, we're always comparing ourselves to the other kids. Some get the A's, some get the B's, some get the C's.
For women, it's their bodies, they're aging a lot of times. For men, it's more success, but I think now it's both for all of us.
Around
Yeah,
success, around
yeah.
money, around what your father did.
Did you have a children? Like, I know for me, I had shame that I didn't have children, like I was barren.
That's right.
And, like kind of, I'm laughing, and that's actually an affect of a defense, right? I'm going to cry now. But yeah, we all have something we regret in life. So, but it doesn't have to be this deep depression, like, I'm going to, hide in my house and never leave because of that. But there's these little things in our life that we're like, yeah, I kind of wish I would have handled that better. I could have done that better.
Right. So that playing out of shame in the affect is flexible, right? Most of us are flexible in responding to that.
Feeling bad if you hurt someone's feelings, and
Yeah.
you feel ashamed, but you talk about it, and you can be open and be vulnerable with that other person.
Absolutely. But now if we think of mood as that long-term pitch of the emotional life, and shame has taken over, right, or hasn't been dealt with, and has been kind of taken root in the individual, and has become a deep sense of inadequacy, unworthiness.
Like nothing's ever good enough. I'm never going to be loved. No one loves me. That kind of like self-loathing, kind of.
Absolutely, self-loathing is a big part of it. But in the realm of mood, right, when that becomes the individual's way of experiencing themselves, then it's a bigger problem, right? That's when people talk about this toxic shame, or shame as being something that needs attention, right? Somebody that needs therapy.
It's almost like that person can't see outside of it. Like you said, they get rigid into everything, filters through that now. So everything someone says, like, you did a great job. And then, really, I did a great job? Didn't I not do a great job the last time? Or, I used to, someone would say, like, oh, you lost a ton of weight. And I'd be like, was I bigger then? Like, like that. But if you always see everything in that, like, someone's insulting me, this kind of, you can't even accept compliments. Is that what you're saying? It's that kind of, your mood is longer, right?
Absolutely. It's kind of a long-standing pattern, and it might be unconscious also. It might be kind of hidden from the individual. They might not realize that they're experiencing shame, but they're seeing the world through that filter of inadequacy, of I don't belong, I'll never fit in, I'll never have what others have, all those things.
And I think that we have all those moments, like you said, the affects, but I think people misdiagnose themselves, and they have these moments, and then it's made a dysfunction because you have these moments. And what we want to do is normalize that we all have these times.
Yes.
And if you can bounce back after it, or it's maybe it's a couple weeks where you go through it, but you're out of it, it doesn't mean you have a dysfunction. It just means you're human and you know how to deal with it.
Yeah, another way to think about it is a spectrum. That on the light side, embarrassment. It's a social instrument that we use to kind of gauge how we're doing in a group, right? And sometimes we embarrass ourselves. And,
why are you looking at me?
and there's nothing wrong with that, right? It gives us information about how we're doing in the group, and how other people react to our words and our presence and all that
The
stuff.
saying the wrong thing, foot in the mouth kind of
Yeah,
thing,
yeah.
or someone being triggered by something you said, but you can bounce back pretty well. You're a little embarrassed. Well, I didn't really mean it that way.
Yes. All the way to the other extreme where you have this deep existential shame that you don't feel worthy of life, don't
Or
feel worthy
goodness.
of love.
Like you just feel like no goodness can come to you. I've heard someone say once they felt like there's something intrinsically wrong with them. Like you feel like you're just wrong or off, and that's like the extreme. And but most of us don't fall into that. Most of us bounce back. We have these moments, and then there's like kind of like an ongoing trigger around something that if we don't deal with it, it's just going to keep coming up for us.
Yeah.
And so that's why we really have to figure out what the root is. And so what's the root of shame?
Yeah, so we can think of that sense of unworthiness is at the root of shame, right? That sense of inadequacy, of deficiency. I used to work with kids who had learning disorders. I mean, their experience of shame was very deep because here you are as a kid starting out, and they're pointing at you and saying, everyone else in the class is okay, but you have some kind of disorder. And we're going to pull you out of class and put you in a special room with a special teacher, et cetera, et cetera. And most of the time these kids...
And the other kids gang up because there's something about being different that you're not like us. So they're like almost like a pattern of being human is to kind of ostracize a person who's different in a way.
Especially children,
Yeah.
right? I mean, kids can be
cruel.
the cruelest.
I know.
Yeah, so...
Well, and I was telling you when you and I first talked about this when we first met, I said, that's how I felt being single, is that you're at this wedding and all the couples and all your friends are getting married. And here I was at the singles table, and one of my friend got married and she called it the desperado table. And I'm like, I'm at the desperado table. And it's that shame of, you haven't found anyone yet. And so we all have those social, like if we don't fit in intellectually, even the way we do things, if we're not, in some cultures, it's about physical strength. Some cultures and family cultures, it's about intellect. Some it's about being just like everybody else. And so we have this kind of feeling we want to belong, but then when we don't, because we're all different, we have a little shame around that. Like, why can't you be like your sister? Why can't you be like your brother who gets A's, And so we grade ourselves in school, and then we get into, as adults, we compare ourselves to who gets the corner office and what kind of trash can you get based on your hierarchy in the company. And so there's all this hierarchy, and as humans, we kind of we're really no matter what you do, there's shame is set up for you to fall into.
Yeah, and it wouldn't be a problem because, again, like we're saying, it's a natural part of our psyche and the way we're evolved to react to each other. But there are no mechanisms for people to work through the shame. That's the problem. That it's never addressed.
It's kind of like no one admits they're ashamed, and then they don't want to admit it to themselves. They want to show it.
That's right. Yeah, they're ashamed of being ashamed. That's a very real problem. You're ashamed of being ashamed. That's how anxiety kind of gets rooted in the human mind.
I was watching this show on mental illness, and a lot of times people would say, if you had a friend who had cancer, and you would say, oh, my friend had cancer, or my family member had cancer, they're going for treatment. There's no shame in that. But mental illness, it's, like you don't want to mention, they're going to a psychiatrist because they can't regulate their emotions, or they feel depressed. You don't want to mention that. Like there's something, like a physical disorder is okay, but a mental disorder is kind of shamed in a way. So we are afraid, like our mental state is, we have to put the persona on that we have it all together. And that puts a lot of pressure on us. Yeah, and so the shame goes in the shadow?
Yes, but let's talk about the defenses a little bit.
Yeah.
So we have natural defenses in our mind, ego defenses. One of the or a couple of the ones that are primarily employed in dealing with shame. The first one is avoidance. So we try to avoid situations where we experience shame.
Like public speaking, that was why people are so afraid of that. Being the center of attention.
Yeah.
They want to blend in. Some people avoid social media altogether because they don't like
Yeah.
the attention. And some people love it, but some people really don't.
Yeah.
So avoidance.
Avoidance. The other one is attacking others or attacking yourself, being very self-critical.
So criticism is a defense against shame. So there was a Netflix show called 15 Minutes of Shame instead of 15 Minutes of Fame. And they were showing all these people that on social media maybe made a comment. One of the examples was the guy who everyone knows the story, the guy who got all the, when COVID first hit, the sanitizers, and he was just trying to make money, and he wasn't trying to hoard it, but the media totally made him this devil, and like how he had to deal and how still he's dealing 2 years later with the impact of people shaming him. And it's almost like we have all this energy in ourselves, and we can't, it's too painful to direct at ourselves. So we have to project it onto others. So we look for scapegoats to project that shame onto. And so if you find yourself on social media criticizing other people or making comments and being negative, you're really deflecting, and it's a defense, right? You're really kind of like, where is that energy coming from? What are you trying to displace onto someone else? What do you like? It's almost like a way to gain your power, right?
Yeah, I mean, we see it in children.
The bullies.
They act out, obviously, because they don't have any other outlet. The kid that's singled out as different, as deficient somehow, the way to reassert their power is to act out, all right, to assert themselves aggressively sometimes.
Kind of find the weaker kid in the group and pick on them.
And so often the bullies are experiencing shame, but then expressing it in this attack towards others.
Yeah, and you see this in many stories of bullies and why they have deep shame that they haven't coped with.
Yeah.
But also the other extreme is either you're the bully or you're just really hard on yourself.
Very hard.
And I think a lot of us, I think a smaller percentage are bullies, and most of us are just so hard on ourselves, and we're so self-conscious and so self-critical, right?
Well, you can think of perfectionism as being on that scale, right? Or that spectrum of defending against shame.
So the more rigid you are about being perfect, the more self-critical you'll be. And so the more flexible you are and more acceptable you are of your mistakes and owning up to them and being, it doesn't define me. Okay, I said the wrong thing. It doesn't make me a bad person. And being conscious of like, it's okay, then you kind of have a healthy relationship with shame. But if you feel like you need to defend against it so much, either get hard on yourself internally and not cope with it, or act out on others, then you really should pay attention, because it's not very healthy. And actually, it doesn't physically. It's really underneath that is anger and a lot of disruptive emotions.
That's right. I mean, it goes on and on. We can talk about physical health as well, being impacted by that kind of holding in of that shame, not being able to express it or to work with it. So, we're going to talk about now, how do we work with shame? How can we start to undo its aversive effects, but also to use it in a creative way, and to help, hopefully, for those of you who have children, how to help them deal with these difficult emotions in a creative, productive way.
I thought of one more defense, which we mentioned in the beginning, before we went into that, is humor. And I know I use that. But if you think of comedians, They're basically they're like the trickster. They're making fun of themselves, and it's a way for them to cope with the kind of but kind of make fun of being ashamed, and I don't know. They do it in a very funny way, and I think sometimes we do. In our family, it's humor is a great defense, and I find myself giggling sometimes when I'm embarrassed or something, and it's that way I cope with it.
Yeah.
And so,
well, it's a way to release some of the energy, some of the emotional energy.
It's better than bullying, I guess.
Yes, but it still doesn't get at the kind of the deeper root of it. And so we want to get to the root of it. So let's talk about how do we begin to approach shame?
Well, I think we need to first acknowledge that it's normal. That it's not shame isn't something to be shamed about, that it's a natural part, and almost look at it as a gift that we have it so we can cope and relate with others. And it's a way for us to, almost like it's a tenderness in a way, because if we're kind of intimate with our own shame, it's so we could really connect with another person. And if they're feeling bad, we can have empathy for them, and we can understand the struggle they have. Especially coaches and therapists or people that do helping work. Being able to cope with your own shame helps you help others, because it's like understanding the human nature, and that it's part of us, but it's not personal. I think that's really the first step. It's not like I'm the only one in the world who's feeling this, and to this extent, and it's wrong. It's more like normalizing it.
Yes. Yeah, certainly that approach reframes what we're working with, what we're dealing with. Instead of seeing it as something to get rid of, which is often what I hear people talking about. They're trying to get rid of their shame. They see it as a big problem that has befallen them, and they desperately want to get rid of it. But what that does, it simply reactivates the defense mechanisms. And the defense mechanisms are usually more powerful than anything you got as far as tools to work with emotions, and they don't get anywhere. You have to first approach it with that deeper understanding that this is totally natural. Like you say, it is a part of our human nature, of our human mind. Therefore, I'm not trying to get rid of it. I'm not seeing it as something to be stamped out and ostracized.
We're not robots or stones. We are feeling emotive people and humans, and that's an emotion that we.
Yes.
It's part of being human.
So instead of seeing it as something to get rid of, see it as an opportunity. You're approaching it with an openness, with a friendliness, a kindness, just the way you would approach a close friend that comes to you and says, I feel shame. You would not try to get rid of them. Right? That would just reinforce their feeling of shame. You would ask them with an open mind, right? How do you feel? What's going on? Tell me more.
And not judge. The non-judgment around it is the key.
That's right.
I also think too, like when you see, I know it shows up a lot on social media that people, I just watch and wonder how people just get all caught up in this back and forth and comments and stuff. Or making nasty comments. I mean, everyone sees them. A lot of coaches, or people that are entrepreneurs, they want to have their social media, and they're so afraid of the criticism. And it's like, if you can deal with criticism, that's a healthy way to deal with shame, because they're criticizing you, and it's like they can only criticize you what you believe is true. If you don't believe it true, then it's their stuff that they're throwing out there. And so that would be a great way to deal with shame too, is like, look at the criticism you're getting, and it's really reflective of what you're feeling about yourself, not them, and then they're projecting onto you what they think about them. So it's just, imagine a mirror like on your social media, and people are going to see themselves through you and reflect through you, just like you're going to reflect what you see. And so when you're looking at that projection, you're understanding, I know a little bit more about myself. And thank you for criticizing me on that thing, because now I can understand where I'm not feeling 100% on that, and really reeling it in. And then that's where you reclaim your power, not fighting with other people online or hiding because you're afraid of what people think. So it really builds strength to look at your shame and really feel welcome it and see it in non-judgment. It gives you courage and bravery.
Okay, so step one, acknowledge that the shame is a natural part of our mind.
Mm-hmm.
Step two, invite it in a friendly, open way.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, it's like inviting an old friend in and being there for them.
Like even make it a little figure, like this like womp womp figure, and just like, come on in and let's talk.
The third step then is what Jung would call integration. Mm-hmm. Because you're acknowledging that this is an opportunity and you're being friendly and open and inviting this emotion in instead of labeling it, judging it, trying to push it away and get rid of it, you're able to integrate it into your awareness in a creative, productive way. Meaning that energy that is holding that shame, or that you've identified as shame and you've pushed away into the unconscious, into the shadow, now becomes accessible to you. Because every emotion is energy, essentially, psychological energy for us. So as we invite that shame into our awareness and we're able to integrate it, that energy now becomes accessible to us for creativity, for love, for
compassion.
Work,
I think if you love yourself more, the more you can love your shame. You can really have this unconditional love. Like, I only love myself when I'm feeling confident. You know what? Love yourself when you're feeling ashamed. And then when you see other people that are acting out or deflecting shame, and you could recognize it, it's like you could send love to them instead of getting triggered by them or defending against them. You could say, oh, that person must seem to be struggling right now, versus making them wrong and like fighting with other people.
Yes.
So it's really like you're making friends with yourself, and then the world is friendlier to you. And that's really the key. It's like how you relate to yourself is how you relate to the world.
And the reason this works is because if you think about this feeling, this interpretation of events or situations that happened to you early on is arising in your mind. Mm-hmm. In other words, the shame is not coming from the outside. It's arising in your mind, and you've been holding it in place by pushing it away, by labeling it as bad, by saying, I don't want to feel this feeling because it doesn't feel good. Mm-hmm. And when we react out of that, if it doesn't feel good, I have to push it away, I have to get rid of it, we're acting in a very kind of a simplistic way with our mind. Mm-hmm. We're not really working with it intuitively, instinctually, or intelligibly.
I think the key overall is flexibility with ourselves, and working away from that rigidness, the hard self-punishment, self-judgment, and be more kind and compassionate to ourselves in all the states and moods that we have. And then that helps us have a friendlier environment with others. And the world feels, like I said, friendlier. It doesn't feel like you have to walk on with armor all the time. We can be free and vulnerable and open and strong and courageous.
Yes, we know it's not easy. Mm-hmm. I mean, these are difficult things, but at least it's the beginning, right, of that ability to transform, to work with your own mind and these difficult emotions. And if you have children, start teaching them about this. Mm-hmm. Just teach them to acknowledge their emotions, to be able to observe them and talk about them. So that they're not necessarily, just because they feel bad, pushed away or pushed into the shadow. That they're able to work with them in a creative way.
And I know a lot of children are ashamed to tell their parents about being bullied, so they hide it. You know, and so it's recognizing those signs and making it normal for them to feel, yeah, that's part of being human, and not pushing it away, not freaking out about it.
Yeah. So
not telling him punch the kid back, you know, like it's like, how can you approach this in a very conscious way?
Yeah, that's right.
So great topic. Wow, this was really deep. I liked it. Very good. Core of a lot of what we struggle with, whether we're conscious of it or not. Maybe at the end of this, you might be like, oh, I don't have any shame. Like, oh, I kind of have a little. And the micro shaming of just being in the world and comparing ourselves to others and where we are in our life and judging, you know, what we accomplished, especially New Year's, you know, what happened in 2021? Why didn't I reach those goals? Or, you know, that kind of, I need to, you know, that anxiety of reaching the next level in our life. And just know that's all rooted in shame. Like we're trying to prove something to the world that we're worthy. What did you say? Worthiness, lovable, and we belong.
Yeah, and that we're enough.
And we already are worthy, loved, and belonged. And we just have to accept that no matter what we do, nothing can ever change that.
Yeah. So next week, we wanted to talk about the myth of Helen of Troy.
Yes, of love, romantic love. Can it be destructive or creative? So exciting topic. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we will see you next week.
Stay well. Thanks for watching.